We joined our program in the middle of a discussion of the Hellenistic world, which is the HW up here, with Central and Western Europe, Eastern Europe and Byzantine area, North Africa, Algeria, and Morocco, and Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt over here, with an extension into Syria. My point in making this division is to say that within this broad circle of the Hellenistic world, there are great similarities and comparatively easy flows of cultural phenomena. So that if you take almost any area of culture, you'll find that transmissions from one part to another are fairly easy. You can translate Greek into Latin, you can translate Latin into German, you can translate Greek into Arabic. The languages differ, but the idea that Aristotle is important is everywhere. The idea that Christianity is important is everywhere. And eventually the idea that Islam is important is everywhere within this Hellenistic world. So when you had crusaders coming from up here to carry on military campaigns over here, it was an invasion by outsiders, but outsiders from within the same very broad cultural context of the Hellenistic world. Eventually, you see flows that come from the southern half and strongly affect the northern half. And this is the transmission of Greek thought and medicine from the Islamic world into Christian Europe, the transmission of ideas of how to do things, how do you manufacture things, and so on, from the Islamic world into Europe. And I'll be talking about that in a later lecture. But the point is that while the Crusaders were outsiders, they were not very far outside. And there was a lot of assimilation that took place. So that the Crusaders who lived in Damascus or lived in Jerusalem or lived in Tripoli and Lebanon fairly quickly came to adopt the local lifestyles. It's a little bit like, let's say, Ashkenazi immigrants from Poland deciding they like hummus. That was a rather nice lifestyle you had in the Middle East, and it got widely adopted. Not spread that much back into Europe, but some of it did. And so you have a conflict between two parts of what is in some respects a fairly unified world. Now, the Hellenistic influences do not spread markedly south of the Sahara Desert. They don't spread markedly into Central Asia, and certainly not into China or Southeast Asia. They don't really spread into India. Not because there were no Muslims in those places or traveling to those places. It was because the basic template of what a civilization is did not extend beyond this Hellenistic world. So you could be learned in the philosophy of Aristotle as interpreted by Al-Farabi or Avicenna, and you could enter into a dialogue with learned Christians in Spain and find that there was a very fruitful reception of your knowledge. But if you had that same body of knowledge and you traveled to India, you would not find local scholars who had any particular interest in it. And the same thing if you traveled to China. for the Indians, who had a cultural pattern based originally on the Vedas and then developing through Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism and so forth, they had their own medical system, Ayurvedic medicine. They weren't interested in Galen and what a Roman thought about medicine. They had their own schools of philosophy. Ancient India had 6 schools of philosophy, none of which really maps directly over Platonism or Neoplatonism or Stoicism or things like that. So you did not have translations from the Arabic works that were vehicles for transmitting the Greco-Roman tradition, transmitting it in an enhanced fashion because of the Arabic commentaries. You didn't have those being translated into Sanskrit. And when they went to China, they weren't translated into Chinese. The Chinese had their own highly developed system of medicine, and they were not interested in what the Romans thought of medicine. They were not interested in what Aristotle and Plato and company thought about the nature of the universe. They had their own philosophical traditions. So the relationship between the Middle Eastern, North African Islamic world and Europe was a very special relationship that was not mirrored by the relationship between the Middle Eastern Islamic world and the other places to which Islam spread in the period after 1300 into sub-Saharan Africa, into South and Southeast Asia, and into Central Asia and East Asia. But before we get to the year 1300, we get to another episode of invasion. And this is the Mongols. So the Mongols are invading 1218, first invasion, 1258 for the second invasion, the one that destroys the Abbasid Caliphate and destroys the already ruined city of Baghdad. The Mongols were vastly more different from the Middle Eastern Muslims than were the Christian Crusaders. They often get linked because they are very close to the same time period. The Crusaders are arriving a little bit more than a century before the Mongols. Both of them offer challenges to Islam as a faith, Islam as a way of life, and the Crusaders attempted to make contacts with the Mongols from time to time to see if they could make an alliance against the Muslims. But the fundamental truth is that the Mongols were vastly different from the people in the Middle East, whereas the Crusaders were not. The Crusaders were remarkably similar and had a religion and a religious tradition that in many ways was the twin of the Islamic one. So the long-term influence of the Crusaders appears to be close to nil. I suppose some of those blondes you find in Lebanon, the people say they're descended from Crusaders. Who knows? Maybe they are. But and occasionally you'll find someone with an Arabic name that means Crusader, like Professor Salibi. But because Salibi means Crusader or person taking the cross. But that being said, there wasn't very much long-term impact. You had improved trade, you had some technical features that were exchanged, particularly in the way of military fortifications. You had some wonderful tales that were told of heroes on both sides. But the Crusaders did not leave a profound impress on the area. Now, the Mongols did not have a significant demographic effect upon the area. So, in some respects, you could say the Mongols did not have much of an impact either, because there are very, very few Mongolian words that show up in Middle Eastern languages. And the only place where you have an ethnic group that seems to actually come from a Mongol background is in central Afghanistan, the Hazaras, who are Shiites in a land that hates Shiism, so they're more or less destined for extinction. But aside from central Afghanistan, the Mongols more or less disappear. Yet the impact of the Mongols should not be judged from vocabulary or demography. It should be judged for how it affected the worldview of the Muslims. The Muslims did not see invading Christians as people they could not deal with. And we have numerous instances among the crusading kingdoms in Syria and Lebanon and Palestine of alliances, tactical, temporary alliances between Muslims and Christians. They more or less understood each other. But when it came to the Mongols, it appeared to be a vastly different world. So what made the Mongols seem so different? It was not their military practices. The Mongols rode on horses. They had huge herds of horses, so they would typically have several in a train, and when one horse got tired, they'd hop off and get on another horse. So instead of having great big war horses like the European knights, they rode a much lighter and smaller and less armored horse, but they had so many of them. They used a bow that was a very efficient bow, but it was a bow that the Mamluks had used. It was not totally unknown in the Middle East. Their tactics were not completely unknown. And indeed, some of the most important tactics for laying siege to cities were tactics that the Mongols borrowed from the Muslims. How to build certain types of siege engine. The practice of killing everybody, alas, was not a completely new thought with the Mongols. You had thoroughly murderous armies before, going back to the Romans, who may have been the most murderous of all the warrior states in history, and at least in the Eastern Hemisphere. The use of propaganda to spread the word of mass killings in order to scare people into obedience was a kind of nuance that the Mongols seem to have introduced. But they were not the first in any of these matters. But they were remarkably different. They were nomads, and you can think, well, they already had nomads from Arabia, camel and sheep herders. You had nomads in Iran who raised sheep and, to some degree, horses and cattle. So there were already nomads in the area. But the Mongols were nomads of a different sort. In Chinese history, the distinction that indigenous historians sometimes make is between raw and cooked nomads. Raw nomads are ones that are so far away from China that they don't know what silk is, and they don't know what tea is. But the Cook nomads are those who were close enough to China to act civilized, to like to wear silk, to like to drink tea, and to essentially look upon Chinese culture as the paramount culture of the world, which they would admire. The Mongols were great admirers of China, which of course made it something they wanted to conquer, and they did conquer it. But they accepted more or less a Chinese view of things in many areas. And yet, they were completely different from the Chinese in certain respects. For example, and you'll wonder why I hit on this example, the way in which they moved from place to place. The largest civilian assemblages of wheeled vehicles in history were those associated with the movement of a Mongol encampment from one place to another, and they were controlled completely by women. The women drove the vehicles and were responsible for setting up the camp. The men were frequently off herding their animals or hunting or carrying on a military campaign, but the women were in charge of moving from one camp to another. The home of a significant nobleman among the Mongols would be a round building made of a bent stick frame with felt on it. This is called a yurt in Turkish. What's a Mongol word? A ger, yes, okay. Just checking to see if anybody knew. It was a yurt or a ger. In modern times, most of the yurts are disassembled, the framework is collapsed, the felt coverings are folded up, and it's all loaded onto two-hump camels. So you have the whole camp is carried in a camel train, which is pretty much what you would find among nomads elsewhere in the world. They use their animals as pack animals to move their teepees or their wigwams or their zaribas or whatever their camp home is. But for the Mongols, they would put this home on a platform and put the platform on wheels, and they would harness oxen to it. And they're the only nomads in the world, Central Asian nomads, who used wheels to move from one place to another. A large yurt, let's say for that kind of commander, might be 20 feet in diameter. So you have to have a vehicle that's 20 feet across. The best observer of this, a European monk or friar known as William of Rubric, wrote that he saw one that was 30 feet in diameter, that the axle was 20 feet long and as big around as a mast, and that it was pulled by 22 oxen, 11 in one row and 11 in the row in front of it. This sounded so bizarre when I first read it that I thought that maybe William of Rubric was doing a Marco Polo and he was just kind of inventing this stuff. And people who've tried to illustrate what this looked like have had a terrible time. They try to imagine a home, 30 feet in diameter being pulled across the prairie. you might imagine a Conestoga wagon 30 feet long perhaps, but 30 feet in diameter? How much would that weigh? My own calculation for the weight of that is somewhere around 8 tons, which would be something that you would require 22 draft animals to pull. It was a very, very heavy thing. And then behind it, there would be 100 or 200 two-wheeled baggage carts that pulled the contents of the home and the provisions for the, for all the people, the food. So that when a Mongol camp was in motion, it was described as being like a small city, because when they stopped where they were going to camp, they would set up their main homes facing south, and they would set them up in a very regular fashion, and essentially they would build a city simply by taking the house and dismounting it and putting it on the ground, and then unloading the baggage and so forth and so on. And all of this was handled by the women. The rate at which they moved was about 2 miles an hour. Now, oxen aren't very speedy animals. And they would simply go across the landscape until they found a place to set up a new camp. So you had the major noble women, the wives of the ruling family and of the major, the primary generals. They would be in charge of hundreds of vehicles, and the entire living system depended on them. This was an expansion of what had been observed in earlier centuries among the people living in Central Asia, because the Mongols did not invent this system. The notion of mobile homes as vehicles for nomads seems to be datable back to perhaps 3000 BC, and it only exists in Central Asia. Used by the Scythians, used by the Turks, various types of Turks, and now used by the Mongols. So one of the consequences of this sort of sexual division of labor is that women played a markedly higher and more important role in Turco-Mongol society than in Arab society or in European society. So when a Khan of the Mongols died, there would have to be a big family meeting to choose who would be the new Khan, the new chief. And since the men were out with the animals or off hunting or waging war, it might take months for them to get back to participate in the meeting. In the meantime, the widow of the dead Khan was de facto the ruler of the Mongol state. And we have clear and explicitly worded instances where it said, that the widow of so-and-so became the interim ruler, and she enjoyed the respect of everybody, that everyone thought she was a terrific ruler. So that's sort of at the top level. Then you get down to a bottom level, day-to-day stuff. And again, women are in a very different position. For one thing, they wear trousers and ride horses. Wearing trousers for Western culture, whether it is Islamic or Christian was something that women were not supposed to do because it was contrary to their nature as women. Women do not wear trousers. Well, this was very difficult. It meant that women couldn't ride horses. You could think, well, they could ride side saddle, but there were no side saddles of any efficiency until around 1650. So even Queen Elizabeth rode on the pillion behind her Lord Chancellor when she went to court, because she had to sit sideways and could not control a horse herself. So the Mongol women, from top to bottom, played a role in society unprecedented in the Middle East, unprecedented in Europe, and unprecedented in China and in India. They were the most the most sexually equal society in those terms that there had been, with the possible exception of the noble Tuareg of the Sahara Desert, where the men veil and the women do not, but that's another story. You had one famous traveler, an Arab who came from Baghdad, who traveled northward and ultimately made it to Scandinavia and wrote a travel report that Michael Crichton turned into a popular novel, which then turned into a not very good movie. And the part of it that always struck me was not in either one, and that is where the visitor is meeting with a Turkish chieftain in his dwelling. And the chieftain's wife is there. And, well, that's not appropriate. You shouldn't have the wife in the room when you're receiving an important ambassador. And then the wife how to phrase this, pulls up her skirt and scratches her crotch. And the Arab visitor turns away. And the chieftain says, don't turn away. In our society, you can look at it, but you can't touch it. But in your society, nobody can look at it, but everyone's touching it. Now, I think that was meant to be a comment on Baghdad manners rather than an explicit thing about the Turks, because in fact the Turkish women wore trousers. But it kind of, symbolizes the degree to which the gender roles of the Mongols were so different. So that as you move on in time, you find that among the Turkish societies that have in their cultural background an element of this history from Central Asia, you'll find that women have consistently a better, let's say, a more trusted and elevated role. Not all women, but particularly those women who are in the ruling class. So the Mongols were different nomads from anyone else because they traveled differently, because they had different gender relations. They had a great concern with natural phenomena. They lived to a large extent, in a city-free steppe land that stretched over seemingly endless space, bordering into deserts in more southern areas and into tundra toward the north, and occasionally into mountainous areas. But essentially, it was simply, unoccupied land. It's hard to imagine. I mean, this is what, my part of the country, Illinois, was like back in the 1600s. But I was once in Tashkent in Uzbekistan, and because there was no plane available, I and several people traveling with me had to rent a van and a driver to drive to Bishkek, the capital of Kyrgyzstan, which meant that we would be driving just along the foothills of the Tian Shan Mountains and through a stretch of Kazakhstan for about 12 hours. Well, that was an area that had never been cultivated. It had been in collective farms, but they were pastoralists. So for 12 hours, there were no buildings, there were no signs, there were no fences. You just had this endless prairie of wildflowers and untouched landscape. And it struck me that this is what the people lived. This was their world back in that era. They believed that there was a heaven. I use the word Tengri sometimes, which they would identify with the Chinese notion of heaven. Sometimes they're called Tengrists, and sometimes called shamanists, because they had cult practices that fit into what we think of as a model of shamanism. But in terms of anything like a deity, they seem to think that there was a Tengri. So that phenomena that they could associate with the heavens, winds, storms, lightning, thunder, these were very important. Thunder in particular. We do not today have the ability to think very easily about how quiet the world was at one time. I mean, I will sometimes in the middle of the night, since I don't sleep very well, get up and sit in my living room in the dark, and I will count the number of different sounds I can hear. And, you know, the building makes sounds. It doesn't intend to, it just happens to make sounds. And then there are sounds, I'm in a very quiet street, but there are sounds outside, and there are sounds of this and that, and there's some idiot playing music, and 3 in the morning. We're never, you know, in city life, it's never quiet. In the primal, by that I mean a non-urban world of the Central Asian steppe, the loudest noises you heard, probably the loudest noise you heard was thunder. I can't think of a louder noise. Animals that made loud noises impressed people very strongly, so that the donkey and the rooster become iconic animals because of their voices. So that, you know, if the rooster crows at dawn, well, that's probably going to signal the end of the world, if it's the right dawn. Donkeys, the braying of a donkey. I had an Arab friend from Israel who said that in his village, if you were carrying a dead body to the cemetery, if you heard a donkey bray, it was bad luck, because a donkey could hear the screams of the people in hell. And people had all sorts of beliefs about the voice of donkeys. And of course, donkeys were spiritually thought to be capable of speech. The Mongols were very concerned about geomancy. So they talk about setting up their encampment. They want to set it up with the directions and the placing of the tents or the yurts that will be in accord with the best traditions of how you determine what is fortunate or unfortunate. The Mongols were very interested in divination. Genghis Khan is said to have divined by looking at the cracks formed in the shoulder blades of sheep when you applied a hot poker to it. In other words, you had a shoulder blade, and you would dig a little pit in the blade, and then you would take a sharp piece of metal and you would heat it in a fire until it was red hot. You'd apply it here, and you would have cracks that would appear. And those cracks could be divined. So you could say those cracks predict the future. This sort of scapulomancy, as it's called, from scapula for a shoulder bone and mancy for rhymes with fancy. This goes back, we know, to the, say before 500 BC, more like 1000 BC in China. The first known Chinese dynasty, the Shang dynasty. We have hundreds and hundreds of surviving evidence of this. They're called oracle bones, where the bone is preserved and you see where the hot poker was applied and you see the cracks. And then they would write in Chinese what their interpretation of the crack was, or what question was asked and how the question was answered by the crack that developed. And this is when you study the earliest known layers of Chinese language. Oracle bones are key, because that is our biggest corpus of the earliest way of forming Chinese characters. If you ever make your way down into the seminar building, seminar room in the depths of this building, it's like about 4 levels down in Kent Hall, you'll find there's a seminar room that has cabinets full of oracle bones. You can see what they're like if the room is not locked. So you still have this being done. In other words, this has been going on for 3,000 years, that people have been divining according to the cracks in bones. In the West, people divined by looking at the lumps on the liver of sheep. And I'm sure a Mongol would have said, lumps on the liver of sheep? That's disgusting. What you do is you take a sheep shoulder bone and you make it crack. And a Roman would have said, oh, no. You know, we have to do lumps on the livers of sheep. But the thing is, these practices, these traditions are all rooted in notions of cosmology and notions of how the universe operates that were distinctive and bore almost no overlap with what you had in the Hellenistic world. Now, the result was that during the period of Mongol ascendancy, which goes from the, let's say, the second decade of the 1200s down to the roughly the second decade of the 1300s for the Middle East. And for China, it goes on for another 50 to 75 years, down almost to 1400. During the period of Mongol ascendancy, they are uniting the eastern and the western ends of Central Asia under a single rule, and then under a divided rule, but the rulers are members of the same family, so you still have traffic across in caravans and cultural context. But what moves along that corridor is highly selective. Highly selective. So that, for example, Muslim astronomers were highly valued. We don't have much of any evidence of Muslim astronomers working in Europe. George Saliba has found indications that Copernican theories were based in part on reading an Arabic manuscript in Italy. And we know that there were certain tables that were used by Tycho Brahe and Copernicus in calculating their theories of heavenly motions, and those tables were compiled in Samarkand. But they were compiled in Samarkand under a ruler in this tradition. Because the Mongols were very interested in divining the future. So you had astronomers, in the plural, heading from Iran and other places in the Middle East into Central Asia and then into China, so that in subsequent times, even after the Mongols passed from the scene, the calendar office in China, that essentially is in charge of time, is largely staffed by Muslims. So that they might not like or have an interest in Galenic medicine. They might not have an interest in the Platonic notion of absolute goodness or something, or in Aristotelian analysis of the polity. But astronomy they liked. And so under the Turkish rulers, you get observatories being built. We have them under Turkish rulers in Delhi, in Samarkand, northwest Iran, Ottoman Empire. This was something that the Mongols were interested in. But there wasn't much that the Mongols were interested in. On the other hand, they were interested in a lot of stuff from China. As I said, this was part of being cooked barbarians. Let me give one example. We have surviving a book on food. It's been translated in English. It's called Food for the Khan. And it's a book on nutrition and on the medical value of foods, compiled by a Chinese physician and nutritionist who worked for the Mongol court. And he has a section that has 60 entries in it on foods that cure various illnesses. I'm going to give some examples. Donkey's head gruel. It cures apoplexy, vertigo, debility of hand and foot, annoying pain of extremities, and trouble in speaking. Donkey's meat soup. It cures wind, mania, and depression, and pacifies the heart. Fox meat gruel. It cures infantile convulsion, epilepsy, spiritual confusion, indistinct speech, and inappropriate singing and laughing. There you go. You all need a little donkey's fox meat gruel. Bear meat gruel. It cures the various winds. Foot numbness, insensitivity, that's what I have. And 5 flacidities, tendon and muscle spasms. It is interesting how many of the parts in this book are predicated upon eating animals that we don't eat. It's just astonishing that the Mongols ate every animal, and there just aren't many vegetables. They weren't growing grain. They weren't growing crops. But boy, they would eat pretty much everything. So here are foodstuffs that mutually conflict. There are 55 entries, including horse meat cannot be eaten together with granary rice. We always think, well, rice must be your staple, but you can't eat horse, which is a favorite, but with rice. Horse meat cannot be eaten with cocklebur. It can be eaten with ginger. Pork cannot be eaten together with beef. This sounds Talmudic, actually. Sheep's liver cannot be eaten together with pepper. It wounds the heart. Hare meat cannot be eaten together with ginger. Beef cannot be eaten together with chestnuts. Mare's milk cannot be eaten together with fish hash. It produces obstruction of the bowels. This just cuts down my personal recipes enormously. Venison cannot be eaten together with catfish. Beef stomach cannot be eaten together with dog meat. Quail meat cannot be eaten together with pork. The face will turn black. Pheasant eggs cannot be eaten together with onions. It produces vermin. Meat of sparrows cannot be eaten together with plums. Eggs cannot be eaten together with turtle meat. When we look at cookbooks from the Islamic world, there's not even anything remotely like this sort of thing. it's true they do talk about, various recipes for, cures and so forth. And the pharmacopoeia of medieval Islam, the books on medically efficient products, was very well developed. But it did not include things like this. It was just a very different world there on the frontier of China and the Mongol nomadic life in Central Asia. Now, on that frontier, seemingly, according to work now being done by Professor Robert Himes in East Asian Languages and Cultures, it is precisely on that frontier where the Mongols first invade China, in the province of Qinghai, which adjoins Tibet. That now apparently, according to works done on genetics, is where you had a there's a word for it. It was sort of an explosive genetic development in the bacillus that causes plague. That plague was, enzoic, that is to say it was normal within the animal population of rodents that lived in the Himalaya mountains, particularly marmots. Sort of a groundhog-like rodent. And something seems to have happened, a mutation at that time, that enabled the plague bacillus to transfer readily to humans. So this apparently, at least this is there have been numerous theories about where the Black Death originated, but this seems to go back to the 1230s, and to be where you get the first references to epidemics there in the frontier between contact with the Mongols and the Chinese that seem to be the precursors of what becomes a Black Death in the Middle East and Europe. In one particularly noteworthy case, it said that after the Mongols had defeated the army and conquered the city of Kaifeng, and now the Mongol army had contact with the local population, 40% of the population died of the ensuing pestilence. The Chinese did not have a word for plague, they did not have a word for Black Death. The people who are now working in Chinese medicine and combing through the history books to find instances of epidemics that might be plague are narrowing in on where the plague originated. And so when it arrives on the north shore of the Black Sea and is picked up by Italians in 1343, it's taken some, close to a century to move all the way across Central Asia, presumably with the Mongol armies, either with rodents that had it or with the fleas that the rodents carried. Now, whether this contributes to the enormous loss of life that was associated with the Mongols is very hard to say. When the Mongol historians, who are all Muslims and all Persians really, writing at the court of the great Khans, when they talk about vast numbers of people being killed, they say that it was killed because they were all personally killed. In one account, they counted up the number of people in the city and they divided it by the number of people in the army and then assigned so many captives to each soldier to kill, so they could exterminate the entire population. Nobody's ever able to show whether that was true or not, or whether this is a propaganda technique. The numbers do not line up. The numbers are so enormous. But undoubtedly there were some colossal massacres. The problem is that this phenomenon is seen overwhelmingly through Muslim and Christian eyes. The Mongol sources talk about it, but the Mongol sources by these Persian writers may be tendentious because you're dealing with a fairly small group of invaders who are trying to maintain rule over a alien and substantial population. So that, say in one case, oddly enough, the case of the city of Nishapur, I don't know why it comes to mind, but in that case, some local people in Nishapur got together and they assassinated the Mongol governor. And there was people in Tus, near Nishapur. They assassinated their governor and they sent the head to Nishapur. And so then the Mongols came and killed everybody in Nishapur. I don't know whether that happened or not. But this is the report. This has led to the Mongols having the worst reputation in history for military violence. And it was a given of sort of world historical thought until about 30, 40 years ago that the Mongols are just this terrible black mark on the history of humankind. Nowadays, not so much. You now have a number of historians who are saying, well, actually, the century of Mongol control from the early 1200s to the early 1300s, where they controlled everything from China to Russia and Baghdad, that was one of the most amazing periods of intellectual and cultural growth in world history. So now you have, if you read any of the current world history textbooks, they will have to show a sort of the pros and cons of the Mongols. Say, yes, they killed everybody, but here are all the good things that happened under the Mongols. And whether that's a legitimate way of doing history or whether you should have some sort of balance sheet. We also, for example, have books written about, yes, the English were bad imperialists, but they brought railroads to Egypt and India. And, you know, the Egyptians, the Indians surely benefited more from the English than they did, than the negative experiences they may have had. This way of doing history by balance sheets, where you try and take something that appears to be negative or appears to be good, because the opposite is to be someone like Michel Foucault and say, yes, the Enlightenment did good things, but the Enlightenment was actually thoroughly evil. So increasingly, historians are sort of looking at major historical questions with polarized lenses. But in the case of the Mongols, the bad Mongol scenario is the one that becomes set indelibly in Islamic history. So the Mongols are looked upon as the worst of people. And the books that deal with this are either the Persian chronicles that are written under the aegis of the Khan himself, or, and more commonly, Arabic books written in Egypt. Because after the Mongols had destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate and killed the last caliph in 1258, there was the death of the great Khan back in Mongolia, and so the ruler of the east of the western portion, Hulagu, who was in command of this force that took Baghdad, he returned to Mongolia with many of his followers to take part in the great family meeting to decide on the next great Khan. His family meeting was called a Kurultai. So Hulagu heads back to Mongolia, leaving an army to control things in Iraq. And that army extends into Syria. And in Syria, in 1260, there is a battle. And the Mongols lose. Battle of Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath. The Mamluks were defeated, or the Mongols were defeated by a Mamluk army coming from Egypt. There were two commanders of the Mamluk army, and that fought the battle and won the battle, and one of the commanders made it back to Egypt. Exactly how and why the other one died, he was probably bumped off by the one who lived. But the man who came back, his name Baybars, a man of Turkic origin, like all the Mamluks at that time. And he proclaimed himself Sultan when he came back to Egypt. And this is the beginning of the Mamluk state that then rules as Sultan from 1260 until 1516 when the Ottomans take over. It is under the Mamluks that books are written that have the goal of profoundly demonizing the Mongols. And they do it in various ways, trying to show that the Mongols are totally different from Muslims. Even though, in the course of time, all the Mongols in the West convert to Islam, the portrayal of their way of life makes them seem to be totally alien. The example that is most vivid has to do with the Muslim requirement that when you slaughter an animal for meat, you have to cut the throat and let the blood drain out of the carcass, because you are prohibited from eating blood by the Quran. So halal and kosher concepts of what meat is permissible to eat are pretty much the same. The Mongols believe that you should make an incision in the chest of the animal and reach in and squeeze the heart and stop the heart so that the blood will remain distributed through the entire vascular system. Because the Mongols believed that that blood was a life force, and that when you're going to eat meat, as I pointed out earlier, they ate vast quantities of meat of all sorts of animals. You were acquiring this life force. You should eat the blood in the flesh, because that's what food was. But by the same token, if you were killing anyone of importance, you should never shed their blood. You could strangle them. You could sew them up in a bag and suffocate them. In the case of the last Abbasid Caliph, he was rolled up in a carpet and trampled to death. Maybe there was blood, you couldn't see it. Because if the blood of the important person, a spiritual person or a ruler, spilled on the ground, then that could be inauspicious for the ruler who had determined that this auspicious individual should be killed. So, according to the Egyptian sources, no Muslim could eat meat if they were living under Mongol rule, because the Mongols insisted that meat slaughtering had to be done according to a Mongol fashion. Now, if we believe that, then we can say, well, this is one of the great steps forward for vegetarianism in world history, but nobody really believes that happened. But it was a big thing because it accurately reflected the Mongol concept of blood and slaughter, but it was highlighted to show how different they were from Muslims, or from Jews, or from Christians. They were just alien people. And then they had the notion that just as the Muslims had a law, the Sharia, the Mongols had a law, which was the law of Genghis Khan. Not a law coming from God, but a law coming from a man who clearly was demonic in some way. And this law was called the Yasa. And so all of the bad things of the Mongols were ascribed to their fealty to the Yasa, the law of Genghis Khan. This was pretty much an unchallenged view down to the 1950s, because it was stated very explicitly in these Arabic sources from Egypt. And then a very distinguished Israeli scholar named David Ayalon wrote a series of articles about what was the Yasa. And he said the Yasa is simply a word for a law or a decree in the Mongol system, and that every Khan had laws. They were like edicts of Roman emperors, so they would simply pronounce an edict. And you might say the assemblage of those edicts constitute a law code, but in that case the law code is really no different from what you would have had in Roman law, a collection of the edicts of the ruler. And it didn't all go back to Genghis Khan. It was just a word for a law code. So when you look at sort of the balance sheet, as I said, about good Mongols and bad Mongols, and looking at it only from the Middle Eastern point of view, one of the things you ask is, what were the consequences of this century of Mongol rule? And I think you can boil it down to a handful of things. Starting with the notion of law. In the post-Mongol period, the notion that you can have an edict that has the force of law, simply a pronouncement by a ruler, which had never been the case under the Abbasid caliphs, because all of their edicts were regarded as non-religious, temporary, and not even detailed. We knew, like, charging a toll on, bringing beef fat into the gate or something. It was unimportant. But after the Mongols, you start to have the idea that you can have rulers who will create law. And the word that they use, oddly enough, is kanun, which is taken from the Christian usage of canon, because canon law, which is the law of the Catholic Church, is simply a overall term for a legal system in which each individual law is called a canon. So that a kanun is an edict. In the Catholic Church, this would be decided upon by a council of bishops, perhaps. Whereas in the Middle Eastern system, it comes to be an edict by a ruler. So we have some texts that are very explicit in taking the word yasa and glossing it with the word kanun, which links it right back to the Mongols. So there is a notion of the role of the ruler in the post-Mongol period that's different from what you had before. Because before you always had this notion that you had a ruler who had worldly power, and the ruler was constrained by the Sharia, the Islamic law, that was formed and maintained by an independent or quasi-independent collectivity of religious scholars. But you didn't have the idea that the ruler could have separate law-making capability. So there's a change in the notion of the ruler as a possible source of law that I cannot see any evidence of it before the period of the Mongols. Suleiman the Magnificent of the Ottoman Empire, whom we'll be talking about in a later lecture, is known in Turkish as Kanuni Suleiman, as Suleiman the lawgiver, giver of kanuns. Something no Abbasid caliph would ever have conceived of, that you would call the caliph a lawgiver. Then you had a geographical division. From 3000 BC down to the Mongol period, the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Iraq, Mesopotamia to the Greeks, was a central area. You had empires that were built on it. You had dynasts in surrounding areas that thought going to Iraq and conquering Iraq was their ultimate goal. And after the Mongol period, Iraq becomes a backwater. It becomes a frontier province between two zones that become increasingly disconnected. There's an Arab zone to the west, which is Egypt, Syria, Palestine, North Africa. And there is a zone to the east that has Persian as its ruling and its cultural language, and its rulers are all Turks. Now, in the west, the Mamluks were Turks as well. The Mamluks of Egypt and Syria, while they were of Turkic background and they spoke Turkish languages, they did not have great esteem for Persian. Persian, if you were an educated person in Anatolia or in Iran or in Iraq, you would certainly know Persian, and you would read Persian poets, and you would esteem the Persian tradition, but not in this Arab zone. When you see a visceral expression of fear at the idea of Iran expanding, when that fear is today, when that fear is ascribed to Sunni versus Shia, this is more or less a tactical expression. It really goes back to the idea that this is when the Arab world becomes autonomous and is freed from the dominance of Iran and the Persian tradition that had grown up during the Abbasid period. In a sense, it's a return to the Umayyad days when the Arabs were dominant. It's just that now that the Arabs have regained their autonomy, they're ruled by Turks. So they're still pissed off. But that division between East and West in the Middle East continues down to the present day, and Iraq becomes a backwater and ultimately becomes largely depopulated. Going into the Iran-Iraq War in 1980, it was no question but what Iraq was one of the few, prosperous and developing, underpopulated countries in the world. And now lots more Iraqis are dead, so it's not getting any healthier. This division has a lot to do with changes in trade, because even though the climate and the agricultural decline of the 11th and 12th centuries had diminished the trade that came down for the Silk Road from Central Asia and China into Iraq. Under the Mongols, that trade largely shifts northward, and it goes to Ukraine and goes into Europe from Ukraine, and the Middle East is largely cut out of the Silk Road trade. Silk Road is still flourishing. It's just that it doesn't go to the same place. And this leads to a development of a new trade route, which really had very little evidence before this time, which is a trade route that goes from the head of the Persian Gulf northward into eastern Turkey to the Black Sea. So you start to have people who are trading north and south from Basra up to Trabzon in eastern Turkey, rather than going east-west from, say, Baghdad to the Mediterranean Sea. So this change in the trade reinforces the geographical division that had been sort of enforced and confirmed by the century of Mongol rule. And then you have the question of religious practices, which I won't go into now, but it gets back into the question of Sufism and whether you're having a significant change in the in elements of Islam as a result of these things that are associated with the century of Mongol rule. But I'll stop for there.